You let me know. Good. Can you hear now, David? There we go. Good morning. Today's daf is daf Chaf Aleph 21 in Shekalim, the second to last daf in Maseches Shekalim. We'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors, the Talmud Torah sponsors, Steve and Terry Czinn, with gratitude to Hashem and welcoming the first grandchild, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, the son of Anna and Yoni Hochbaum of New York City, as well as Benjamin and Elys Wohl, with immense debt of gratitude to the Rebbe for inspiring and changing the way we approach Pesach, Shimmy Batsheva, the daughter, and Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's father, Shmuel ben Zechariah, and mother, Leah Bas Avrohom, and great-grandmother, Tziril Bas Rav Dov, who are all niftar, providing the ability to return to shul in person for Daf Yomi and for davening, and thank those appreciate having you. It fills up the room. Daf Yomi is sponsored by Greg and Rachel Levitan in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Rachel's beloved Good. I thought I read the wrong one, but good. Baruch Hashem, we got it all in there. I have to start all over again, straight from the top. Okay, we are beginning three lines. We are beginning 3 lines from the bottom of Chaf Amud Beis, Kain Gadol Shemes, the 2 dots on the bottom of Chaf Amud Beis. Kain Gadol Shemes. So the Mishnah talked about what happens if a Kain Gadol dies. Now, it's important to note, the Mishnah said, there's every day he had to bring a certain mincha. It was part of the daily routine. Now, if he dies, there was a machlekes, there was a dispute, who actually has to pay, who has to bring switched around. Jeremy, I'm not sure if it's working. I don't know. Moishe's job. I don't know if he's here. The opinion of Reb Shimon is switched around. In other words, we seem to have a stira in the opinion of Reb Shimon. Taman Amar Mishal Yarshim. There it says it comes from the Yarshim. V'hacha Amar Mishal Tzibor. Over there it says it comes from the Yarshim. In other words, it comes from his estate, what he leaves over for his children. V'hacha Amar Mishal Tzibor. And here it says it comes from the tzibur, from the communal funds. So Amar Rav Chia Bar Ba says, V'lo ye'aisu maksha, isn't he asking a very good question, which is more of like a Yerushalmi type of talk, to just throw in there just an additional point that it's a good question. So Asar of Yaakov Bar Acha, and Rabbi Avo b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, he came to answer the question. He said the following. This is really what happened. Dvar Torah really midairaisa, hu sheteheba minat tzibor. In other words, midairaisa, it comes from the tzibor. So what's this discussion of whether it comes from the tzibor or it doesn't come from the tzibor? So what happened was here, kiven de chazi de midcha kalishka. It ended up costing the lishka, which was the fund that they had available. It cost them too much money. It was becoming a strain on the lishka. So what they decided was, it's true that it does come from communal funds, but the way they established it was, Hayisi Aimer Yigvula. They would just go ahead and collect the money. Instead of taking it from the regular, already established fund that they had to pay for the carbon, they would go ahead and establish a collection, a special collection to pay for that mincha. Ultimately, that didn't work out so well, so hiskinu sheteheba michumas halishka. They decided to ultimately go back to the old system of collecting it from the Trumas Halishka. So in other words, when we're talking about coming from the Tzibor, it was of course it was established that it came from the Tzibor. The question just was, what system did they use to pay for it? Was it from the established fund that they had in the Lishka already, or was it money that they would go ahead and specifically collect for this carbon? So originally they collected special for it, but it ended up that they switched it back to taking it straight from the Lishka. Rabbi Yisa Amar Rabbi Yechanan by Mahu. So this explains the Karban Eda, that the Mishnah said V'shleima Haisa Kreva. It would be, they would make sure to be makravit, they would bring it completely, it would be brought whole. So the Gemara asks, Mahu, what did this look like? Shleima B'shachris, V'shleima Bein Arbayim. Did they bring two? In other words, was it two whole Karban Minchas? Or Aishlema B'Shachris, they brought the entire thing in the morning because they had to bring it in its entirety, and by default that meant Ubetela Bein Arbayim, in the afternoon there was nothing left to bring because they already brought the whole thing. So the Gemara said, Kad Tehe Pshitole D'Chsiv Minchas Tamid, then Shleishes Lugin Mahain, Shleishes Lugin Shachris, or Shleishes Lugin Bein Arbayim, Lugu Mechza Shachris, Lugu Mechza Bein Arbayim. So kate pshitale is kind of like an expression that we have in Bavli, which is im timtzi loymar. If you're going to answer this question and ultimately determine that the answer is you have to bring the whole thing, why? Because we're comparing it to a carbon tamid, and carbon tamid is always brought in its entirety. You bring two every single day, and therefore you'd say the same thing is true with this carbon mincha as well. So then we'll ask you about the shleisha lugin, the three lugin, which is a measurement. Would that be brought? Can you split that in half? In other words, it would be 1.5 and 1.5. Or would they double it and bring 6 to have 3 whole lugin brought twice a day? We also need to answer about the Shnei Kahn, the Kahn by the Mincha, the way they would pull out the Kahmitz. So the question is, Mahain, Shnei Kahn b'shachris, Shnei Kahn bin arbayim, do they bring 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon? Ay Kahmitz achas b'shachris, the Kahmitz achas bin arbayim. In other words, they would just split it in half and bring 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. This is obviously a big difference because depending on whether or not they had to bring 2 whole ones was literally doubling the amount of the carbon. Don't we learn? He's trying to answer the question now. Don't we learn the entire concept of the kaimetz from minchas chayte, sinners, carbon, a carbon mincha, mala halon shnei kaimsin, avkan shnei kaimsin. We should just be able to compare it, just like there are 2 kaimitsin, there are 2. So we'd say the same thing over here. Don't we learn the concept of bringing the 3 lugin from a carbon tamid, shel bein arbayim, mala lon shleishos lugin, avkan shleishos lugin. We would say just like there you bring 3 each time, you bring 3 times there, 3 here as well. So the Gemara says, but hold on a second. Umatamon tzrichalei, avkan tzrichalei. So ultimately the Gemara says, that the expression of tzrichale means tzrichale, we need to clarify it. We still don't know the answer. In other words, the Gemara is leaving off with what we call a bayad le'ifshata. We don't have an established answer because even over there, by carbon tamid, we weren't sure. So therefore, we're left off with the question, we do not know whether it has to be brought entirely. In other words, do you double it or do you just split it in half and bring half in the morning and half in the afternoon? Okay. In the Mishnah yesterday, the Mishnah talked about the Afer, the Afer being the Me'ilah in the ashes of the para. So just to go back to the Mishnah, to quote the Mishnah very, very quickly, the Mishnah says there were 7 takanos that they made. So when you say the word takana, naturally what that means is that it's midrabana. A takana is something which is rabbinically imposed, and it says over there were 7 takanas, and one of them was Al ha'etzim shiu kehanim nius ben val para on the para shalo yehu moyalim ba'afra, that there should not be a concept of me'ilah in the afra, in the ashes. They would burn the para, it would turn into lots of ash. So technically speaking, whenever something belongs to hektish, whenever something is of consecrated materials, if you steal it, it's a glorified type of stealing, which is not simply stealing, it's stealing from hektish, which is much more chamor, comes along with the requirement for a carbon and an additional fine. So the takana here was that there was no me'ilah, there was no concept of Me'ilah if one were to steal the ashes of the para. So the Gemara asks, Shimmy Bar Nachman v'Shem Rabbi Yonasan. Shimmy Bar Nachman says, Bedinu sheyimalu behen. Really, midairaisa, from a biblical standpoint, we should say that there is Me'ilah. V'hein gazru shala yimalupa. They made a takana that no, we're going to move away from the dairaisa and there's not going to be Me'ilah. So just to point out, we never find that the Chachamim are Aikar Davrim and Torah can uproot something in Torah bikum va'aseh. To say, you know what, the Torah says if you do this, it's stealing, but we're going to say, you know what, it's not. So we have to understand, there's a lot that's said on this topic, but generally speaking, Me'ilah, as I introduced it, is a glorified type of theft. So now if it's in the category of theft, so then we can decide if there is somebody who is in charge of it, who has rights to make decisions for it, they can be meichel, they can forgive on the theft. So in other words, we can't say the Torah says that it's usher to be Mechal Shabbos, and we'll come along to the Chachamim and say, you know what, we decided it's permissible this week to be Mechal Shabbos. It's not how it works. The Torah has certain requirements, and the Chachamim don't have the ability to uproot it. Here we're talking about a concept of geneva, of gezela, of stealing. So the Chachamim also going to, so that's really that means ultimately established, you need to have a basin of equal size and chachma to be able to uproot it. So it must have been that this happened within a short time frame. So it was the same basin that imposed the Me'ilah that ultimately was able to remove it. Okay, going back to the And so ultimately the Gemara says that since it was not clear where it was supposed to go, they would use that money to buy an oila. It was okay to use that money to buy an oila. So the Gemara says, very nice. Very nice that it's permissible to buy an oila with it, but ultimately we have a problem. Ha'isha azais b'mahi miskaperes. This woman, she donated money because she wanted to have the birds brought as a carbon for her. She's going to lose her carbon. She's going to lose her ability to have a kapara because her money ultimately went to buy the wrong type of carbon. So very nice that it's mutter to use that money to buy a carbon ayla, but there's some lady here who donated the money in order to buy herself a bird for a carbon, and she's not going to get her kapara. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yitzchak, tonight based in who, Hamesapek esakinim, humesapek esapsules v'esa'uvdes. It's a tonight based in, and we discussed this also yesterday, that the Chachamim, the Beis Din, has a right to be able to designate what happens here through their power of Hefker based in Hefker. And what we say is, if she donated the money, the one who's in charge of it ultimately will redesignate birds for her carbon, and don't worry about it, she will indeed get the carbon that she needs, and she won't be left without the kapara. Hadron Allah Parak Mois Shenimtzu. We're starting now the 8th and final parak, of Masech Shekalim. So the Mishnah, Halach Aleph, Mishnah, Kol HaRoikin HaNimtzayim BiYerushalayim Tahirin. So with regard to the topic of Tumas Zav, any liquid, saliva of a Zav is going to carry the Tumah with it. So now the Mishnah is talking about what happens if someone finds roik, saliva, in Yerushalayim. Do they have to assume that it came from a Zav or not? Now, in the last year, we've become super conscious, germ conscious, and to think of someone coming in contact with someone else's saliva is something which is, unfathomable. But again, we're talking about thousands upon thousands of people walking up the same path, and if someone had some phlegm and spit on the side of the street, so now if someone's walking and steps on it, they can become tamei. So if someone notices that they mistakenly stepped on someone's saliva, they have to know, am I tamei or not? So the Mishnah is going to determine whether or not, I don't think they had sanitizer along the whole way as they were going up to Yerushalayim. But perhaps, Emerz Hashem B'Karev, when Mashiach comes, maybe they'll start putting hand sanitizer there. But ultimately, we have to determine, is it going to be tamei or not? So the Mishnah says, Kol HaRoikin HaNimtzayim BiYerushalayim Tahirin. All the roik, all the saliva that you find in Yerushalayim, we assume it's going to be tahar. Chutz mishal shuk ha'elyon. Besides for saliva that's found in the upper marketplace, we'll see in the Gemara what was wrong with the upper marketplace. Tivi Rabbi Meir, Beis says, it depends. When are we talking about? During the rest of the whole year, or specifically are we talking about during the regal? So B'shai Kali Ma'asashana, in the rest of the year, Sheba Emtza Tameim. Saliva that's found in the middle of the road is going to be Tamei. Shebet Stadim Tahirin. What's on the side of the road is going to be tahar. In B'shas HaRegel, in the times of the regel, when people are coming to Oila Regel, Sheba Emtza Tahar was the opposite. What was in the middle was considered to be tahar. Shebet Stadim Tameim was on the side is going to be tahar. And ultimately, the Gemara explains the reason is because that when they were coming up to Oila Regel, they changed the path because of the majority of people who were coming. We'll see that in the Gemara. And the Gemara, Mishnah explains actually, because the minority always moves to the side. So during the rest of the year, people could be tamei. Many people are just tamei because many things happen. People are not necessarily going to the mikveh to purify themselves for their aliyah l'regel. So someone who wants to remain tahar, move to the side to protect yourself. During the time everyone's coming up to Eretz Yisrael, to Yerushalayim, to be aliyah l'regel, so the majority of people were tar. So if you're tamei, you go to the side. We don't want you to mess everything up for everybody else. So now, Kol HaKelim HaNimtzayim BiYerushalayim Derech Yiridu LeBeis HaTevila Tameim. It seems like there was a special path that went down to the mikvah and another path that came up from the mikvah. So now, all the kelim that are found on the way down could be assumed that they dropped while they were going to the mikvah for the purpose of immersing them, to make them tahar. So if you find it on the way down, we assume it's still tamei. Derech aliyah, on the way back up, we assume it already went through the ritual purification process of going into the mikvah. And therefore, we say it's going to be tahar. The Gemara says, Shaloik yiridasan aliyasan, the path that took them down was not the same path that took them back up. I assume that maybe there was a lot of traffic, and they didn't want to have people going both directions, so they had different ways to go. Divi Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Kulan tahar, and says they're all tahar, chutz min asal, v'hamagrefa, v'hamaritza michadim lekvares. Besides for the basket, there was a hammer and a shovel and a hammer that they used to use for burial purposes. We'll see later on in the Gemara, it's not exactly clear what they did with this, but ultimately it's hard to think about this, but they would have to sometimes break the bones of a mace in order to allow it to fit inside the caver. So all these tools were used either to dig they were all used for the purpose of burying. So we could assume that if these things are used to come into contact with a corpse, so then they're going to be tamei. So Rabbi Yossi's opinion is all kalim are going to be tahar, besides for the specific ones that are used and known to be used for coming into contact with a mace, and those are going to be tahar. Sakin shenimtzas b'yudalot sheichet b'miyad. We learned this already in Maseches Pesachim. It's actually interesting. I actually think that I gave daf this day when we learned this Gemara. I believe it was a Shabbos, and we learned halacha. If you find a random knife in the streets of Yerushalayim right before Pesach, can you assume that the knife is going to be is tamei, or do you have to assume it's tamei, or can you assume that it's tar? The Gemara says if it's on Yudalid, if it's on Erev Pesach, sheichet b'miyad. Why? Because we assume it's already been purified because it's going to be used for the carbon. Now, again, thousands of people were coming, so it's very common that someone might drop their knife and someone else would pick it up. We assume that it was already purified to be used for the carbon Pesach. B'shlei sha'asar, it was found on the 13th day. Shainu matbil, you have to go ahead and table it again because we don't know if it was done yet. Kufitz, second, kufitz, if it's a meat cleaver. So this is something which can't be used for a carbon Pesach because a meat cleaver generally is very sharp and it's intended to cut through the bones. Carbon Pesach cannot have any broken bones, so no one used the kufitz on a carbon Pesach. So whether it was found on the 14th or the 13th, Shainu Matpil, you have to table it again. And the Gemara in Maseches Pesachim explained the reason why we don't assume it was shechted for the use of the carbon chagiga, which was also brought, is because of a very interesting sveka. In other words, people had to consider whether or not they were going to have to use it. There were two svekas that they had to consider before preparing to use their kufitz for carbon chagiga, and people didn't assume that they were going to need it, and therefore it was very reasonable that they did not taivel it. If the 14th of Erev Pesach fell out on Shabbos, sheichet b'miyad, they could shecht it right away, even if it was found on the 13th. Why? Because you have to prepare it earlier, because you can't taivel it on Shabbos. B'tes vav sheichet b'miyad, nimtza kishur l'sakin, if you find the kufitz connected to the shchita knife, in other words, you find a meat cleaver on the same ring as a shchita knife, you could assume that when you taveled one, you taveled the other one. It's kind of like a keychain. If you tavel one, they all go in. So in other words, it follows the halacha of the sakin. So therefore, even though generally a meat cleaver would not be permissible if it was found on the 13th, but if it was on the 13th, but if it was connected, on the 14th, but if it was connected to a shchita knife, it would be fine. You could assume it was taveled. Rabbi Avram b'Shem Rabbi Shua Levi. Rabbi Avram b'Shem Rabbi Shua Levi explains the reason why we assume that in the upper marketplace, the reik, the saliva, is going to be tamei with the tumah of the zav, is because katzron shel nachrim hayasham. They had a laundry market, a laundry place of non-Jews. So now the halacha is that the chachamim were geyser tumas zav on all non-Jews. Whether or not they're tamei with tumas zav, there was a gezer that we always assumed them to be tamei with tumas zav. So that's the reason why we assume that the saliva there is tamei, is because there's all types of nachrim there. Amar of Chanina, arudais hayu noichrim b'Yushalayim. He gives another explanation that they would shecht arudais, which were, I think, wild donkeys. They would shecht it there. So the Gra adds in over here a bit of a story. He says, Maisa hayu noichrim arudais basrat yeshamalach v'ayle regalim mishtakim b'dam ad arkuvayseim. They would check these. They would kill these animals in Yerushalayim, and those who are walking up to the Oile Regal, they encountered a tremendous amount of blood. Now it says it came up to their knees, similar to what it looked like the Gemara describes in the Beis Hamikdash and Yom Kippur. But ultimately, it says there was tons of blood around. So now we have a shaila whether or not that blood causes tumah. So they came before the chachamim and said, "Listen, we are coming to Be'er L'Regel. We encountered all this blood from these wild donkeys that were shechted here. So they wanted to know, are they tamei?" But they didn't answer the question. They didn't have what to say about it. So Rav Simon b'shem Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, with Rav Simon in the name of Yeshua ben Levi, he had a Maisa b'preda Mishal Beis Rabbi Shemesa. There was a story with this animal in the house of Rabbi Shemesa, which died. The tiaru domea mishum nevela. They said its blood is going to be tar mishum nevela. So here we have a story where we're saying that the blood of a nevela is not tameh. In other words, what we have here is a question. The nevela is tameh. A nevela has tameh. The question is, what about the blood that comes from the nevela? So nechira obviously is not a shchita. So they just slaughtered these animals without proper shchita. So it's a nevela. Now the question is, does that dam now carry tumah with it? So they weren't sure. Originally they asked the Chachamim, they didn't give them an answer. Now we have this story with Rebbe where it seems like they said, the tiaru dameh mishum nevela, we said that yes, the animal is tameh, but the blood that comes from it is not tameh. So Rabbi Lazar sha'al Rav Simon. Rabbi Lazar asked Rav Simon the following question. Ad kama, until how much? V'lai agivei. He didn't answer him. So his question ultimately was, when we're talking about blood not becoming tameh, does that mean it's not tameh at all, and it's always going to be tar regardless of how much? Or perhaps it has to do with the amount of blood that we're talking about. Maybe there's a shear. Maybe the reason why they were tar is because there wasn't enough blood. So now so he didn't answer him. Simon didn't give him an answer. So he wasn't sure. He doesn't know if maybe it's not tameh at all. Maybe it is a little bit, it's tameh, but only up to a certain point, or after a certain point. So Shal Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Ad Revius Tahar, Yosemi Kan Tameh. The answer of Yeshua ben Levi, maybe the shear is a Revius. Maybe it has to be that there's a certain amount. A Revius. Maybe after that it will be Tameh. Ubash L'Rabbi Elazar, Deloy Chazar L'Rav Simon Shmuasa. So he was upset that he didn't give him an answer. Rav Bibi have a Yosef, he was sitting there, and have a Masni have a Uvdan. He was telling over this story. Amar Yitzchak bar Bisna ad kama. He asked him, until how much? Amar le ad revius tar yeser mi kan tameh. He asked the same question, and he wanted to know, is it that it's not tameh at all, or maybe only after revius? Ubat bein, he kicked him. He asked him this question, and he kicked him. So Amalei Rav Zrika said to him, begin to have a shalach. They ask you a question. Atbot bei. You kick him. Guy asks you a question, it's a legitimate question. You kick him. Is that how you respond to somebody? Amalei begin the lehavis daitibi. I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't concentrating. He was asking me a question. And he explained, I'll tell you why I wasn't able to concentrate. To Amar Rav Chanin, the pasuk in Parshas Kisava in the Teichachach says, V'hayu chayecha tuluin l'cha mineged. The pasuk says your life will be hanging in the balance. Zeh shehu loikeach lechitim l'shana. That's somebody who takes chitim. He only has a storehouse of wheat for a whole year. He doesn't know what's going to be next year. He only knows what's going to be this year. The next part of the pasuk, ufachada tolayla v'yoymam. You'll be scared night and day. Zeh shehu loikeach min hasidki. That's someone who buys from a warehouse, but ultimately he doesn't have a large amount put away. He has a little bit put away. You won't believe in your life. That's somebody who literally does not have any wheat stored. He needs to go to the baker every single day to buy bread. So every day is a new question, will I have bread for today? So it's a tremendous amount of agmas nefesh that a person has. Will he have parnasa? So he responded to me, he said to him, Va'ana samach hapaltira. I am somebody who doesn't have that much money. I rely on the baker every day. So literally he was saying to him, I am overwhelmed and consumed with my worry about my parnasa. I was concerned about how I was going to feed my family, and you came to ask me this complicated question about the blood, about the dam of the nevela, and simply I just have to say to you, I just wasn't able to concentrate at that point in time. I'm sorry, I was overwhelmed with my parnasa, so therefore when you came to ask me, I just sent you away. So my Kedayin, what's the halacha? After this very exciting story, what's the halacha? So Hayid Rabbi Yeshua ben Peseira al dam nevel shutar. Yeshua ben Peseira, he testified that it's going to be tahar. Ma'u tahar. What does it mean that it's tahar? Tahar milahachshir halitmais tamei. So the Gemara asks, when you say tahar, it's not exactly clear. Although pure means pure, but sometimes tahar doesn't actually mean tahar. Maybe it just means that it's tahar, that it can't be machshir something else to be mekabel tuma. No, the halacha is that there are zayin mashkin. The acronym is Yad Shachatam. There are zayin mashkin that can prepare something to become tamei. Maybe this type of blood can't prepare something to become tamei, but it actually itself can become tamei. So Gemara says, "Taman tanina dama sheretz tamei kibesarai metame v'enei machshir." It says over there about the dama sheretz, the blood of a rodent. It's metame kibesarai. Metame, it's metame v'enei machshir. It can't prepare something else to become tamei. V'ein lanu kayetze bay. It says there, this is the only example of something that can become tamei but can't prepare something else. So I'm sorry, we already have a trademark on that, and that's the only thing that can have that is the blood that comes from a sheretz, but it's not going to be relevant. It can't be relevant to blood that comes from an avela. So the Gemara says, hold on. Maybe ve'ein lanu kayetze bay kashir tu masai aval domim metame kibesarai. Maybe it's only with regard to the shear. So Amar Rabbi Yosi Pligi Batrei Amiroyim. There are two Amiroyim who discuss this. Chad Amar Tamei v'Chad Amar Tar. One says it's Tamei, one says it's Tar. And Man da Amar Tamei is Rabbi Yehuda. Man da Amar Tar Rabbi Yeshua ben Pesaira. Ultimately, the machlekes comes down to machlekes between Rabbi Yeshua ben Pesaira and Rabbi Yehuda. And Amar Le Rav Avduma Demin Nechusar. Rav Avduma from Nechusa said, "V'yei you are correct." Why? Rabbi Yehuda, Marina de Benesia, he was ultimately the Pesach of the Benesia, and ultimately it makes sense that he would have been the one to be Metamea. Okay, the Mishnah says, Kol HaReikin. Mishnah talks about the saliva. So the Gemara says, Like Kain Amar Rabbi Vo B'Shem Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina. Rabbi Vo ben, in the name of Rabbi Yosef ben Chanina, didn't say this. He said, like Gazru Al HaReikin Shav Yushalayim. They were not Gazer on the saliva in Yushalayim. So the Gemara says, and the Taklin Chadatin points out that the one who was saying this brisa did not know what we said earlier about the upper marketplace, so they had to stick it in. Itmar aleh Reb Avim b'Shem Yeshua ben Levi katzon shatan nachram hayasham. He didn't. In other words, he didn't know what happened with that cleaners, with that laundry service was run by the nachrim, and therefore they had to correct him to say, you're right. We're talking about that place where they had those nachrim. Okay, Shibailes means they would go in the middle, and the rest of the year, the Tmeim went in the middle. The Tahirim, those who are pure, went on the side. The Gemara adds in a whole lashon here. We'll just continue with what we find for us on the page. Tahirin mahalchin stam. Those who are tar went in the stam went all over the place. And what they do about Tamein Aymer Lahan, the Tamein would say to them, "Paraish, stay away from us," because they were the majority. B'shas haregel, during the time of Yantiv, when people were being oil regel, hatahirin mahalchin shibelis. Those who are pure went in the middle. V'atamein mahalchin minatzad. Those who are tummy went on the side. Those who are tamei, they just went. The Tahirin would make announcements and say, "We're tar, stay away from us. Make sure to stay away from us," because they are the majority. Okay, all the kalim that were found, we said that they're going to be tahar. Like Kain Amar Bava b'Shem Rabbi Yechanan. Like Gazru ala kalim should be Yerushalayim Mikimin shenimtzu derech yiridu lebeis hatvila nasu leichiach. Since, in other words, the Gemara is asking, we didn't say that. We said that that's not true. So in other words, the Gemara says, Mikimin shenimtzu derech yiridu lebeis hatvila nasu leichiach. In other words, you're right. A stam keli, any average keli that was found in Yerushalayim, we assumed it was going to be tar. But this has a problem. Why? Because mikiven shenimtzu derech yiridu lebeis hatvila nasu yechiach. It's kind of like a proof that it became tamei. Abashala yikairo eisen tziparin. With regard to those kalim that we talked about in the Mishnah, he called them a tziparin, a fingernail. Man damar tziparin shaydav tziparin. It looked like a fingernail. Man dama maritza, those who called it maritza, shemaritza es ha'evan lekvaris, they would bang the bones to make sure that they fit into the Beis HaKvaris. Kupitz, Tanya sakin keshura la hareza kamei. So talk about this kupitz, this meat cleaver. The Gemara says, really the Gemara here is learning the opposite. Our Gemara that we read on the top of the page said that if you have a meat cleaver attached to a sakin, we could assume that it's going to be tar because the sakin would have been purified in order to allow it to be used to shech the Karban Pesach. Here we learn the opposite. A sakin kishurala, if you have a sakin which is connected to the kupitz, we don't assume that because the sakin became tahar, then the kupitz became tahar as well. It's the opposite. We assume that since there's a kupitz on this ring, he probably didn't taivel it, and therefore the sakin is also not going to be tahar. So it's exactly the opposite. We'll do this last piece of this last Mishnah over here, halacha beis. Masnisin, pareiches shenitme bevlad atuma. A pareiches from the Beis Hamikdash, the curtain that was hanging in the Beis Hamikdash, which became tummy with a vlad hatuma. So we know the concept of tumah. We have avatuma, and then the avatuma is metame oichlenu mashkin, and people, but it's not metame kalim. It's not metame kalim. But kalim become tummy only a tumah midrabanan. What's relevant to that is, we're going to see soon, that a tumah midrabanan does not require ha'arav shemesh. It does not require that you will taivel it and then ultimately wait until evening to use it. So the pareiches that became tamei b'lada tumah, it's a keli. It only becomes tamei with tumah midrabanan, which is second generation tumah. Halach is matpilin isa b'fnim. You can taivel it inside. Umachnis isa miyad. You immediately bring it back in, and you could put it back in its place. V'shenitme ba'avatuma became tamei with an avatuma. Then, which is the primary tumah, then the halach is with and is also midiraisa. Matpilin isa b'chutz. You have to taivel it outside. V'shaytchen isa b'chel. You spread it out in the chel, which was outside. The pnei shehitzricha ha'arav shemesh. It needs to wait until evening for the tumah process to be completed. Now, im ha'isa chadasha. If the pareiches was brand new, then shaytchen isa al gag ha'itztava kedei sheyira ha'am es malachte shehina'a. The Takn Chadatin explains that just like we have a concept of taiveling brand new kalim, in other words, it's an elevation process. When you buy kalim from Nachrim and you use it for Jewish purposes, then there's a tevila to elevate the keli. So we did the same thing for the pareiches. It was used for an elevated status for the Beis Hamikdash. They put it through a purification process, even though it wasn't tamei. Now what they would do is they would taivel it, and then they'd spread it out on top of the itztava, so everyone who passed by could see it, and they can say, oh wow, look how beautiful that pareiches is. It's soon going to be inaugurated to be used inside the Beis Hamikdash. Shimmy ben Askan, pareiches oivea tefach. The pareiches was a tefach thick. Al shivim ushtayim nimin ne'ereges. That had 72 threads. The threads that were used to weave it were made from 72 threads. So it was kind of thick. Now, al kol nima unima, every one of those 72 threads was chaf dalakutin, was made from 24 threads. Arka, its length was mem amma, 40 amas, v'rach, but its width was chaf, it was 20 amas. Umishmainim ushtayim riboy haisa naasis. It was made from 820,000. Vishtayim oisen b'chol shana, they make 820,000 threads, and it was vishtayim oisen b'chol shana, they made, because I think 82 times 10,000. Yeah, so 820 riboy is 10,000. So it was 820,000 threads, and then vishtayim oisen b'chol shana, they would make 2 every single year. The shloish meis kehanim atbilin said they needed 300 kohanim to taivel this massive thing when they taiveled it. We're going to see soon that it's actually, the Gemara says that they needed 300 kohanim to taivel it. It was a guzma, it was an exaggeration. But I did see somewhere that the Gemara writes that although the Gemara says it was an exaggeration, he does the math to find that there was exactly enough space on this pareiches for 300 kohanim to be able to get their hand on it, to be able to be taivel it. So technically it was possible to be able to get 300 kohanim to hold on to it. It was a covet to be able to be the one to taivel it. So if they technically wanted 300 kohanim to do it, they did it. Ilu Amar, the Gemara now analyzes it. Ilu Amar chot, if it would just say it was 1 chot, it would be 1. Kafel, it says kafel, then it would be shtayim. Shazor, it would turn into 3. Mashzar doubles it. Mashzar makes it into 6. So now arba, because every thread that they used to make the pareiches we know was made from techelas, argaman, telashani, and sheish, it was blue, purple, it was red, and they had the white linen. So each thread was made from 4. So if you have 6 and you multiply that by 4, so that turns it into 24. Mikan ha esrim v'arba, you had 24. Tani, we learned in the Mishnah, shleishim mushtayim, it was really 32. Why? Because ilo marchot, it was achas. Kafol l'shnayim turned into 2. Shazur doubles 2 into 4. Now mashtar doubles the 4 into 8. 8 times 4, because each thread was made from 4. So now you have arba mikan hat tlatzin v'tartan, you had 32. Tana ha'arbayim ushmayna, really it was 48. Why? Because they understand it differently. Ilo amar chot echad, if we just say chot, it would mean it was 1 thread. Kafol l'shnayim turns it into 2. Kliya, when it says kliya, that adds in 1 extra step, which makes it into, kliya is like it was woven, it was spun. That turns it into 3. Shazor now doubles the 3 into 6, l'shisha. Mashzar takes the 6 and doubles that. So now we have l'shnei masor, you have 12. Now you have each thread was 4. So arba mikan, you take 12 and you multiply that by 4. It's getting very complicated over here. But the Gemara gives us the answer and tells us it is ha arbayim mutmanya. Here we have 48. 12 times 4 is going to be 48. Kasav echad oimer ma'aser. One pasuk says that this pareches was considered an art, a work of weaving. The Kasav echad oimer, another pasuk says ma'aser chayeshev. It was ma'aser chayeshev. Ma'aser reikim, what does that mean? It is parts of echad. There was one face woven into this curtain. Ma'aser chayeshev says shnei partsufes. There was now 2 faces woven into it. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemiah. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah discussed this. Chad Amar Ma'aser reikim. One says it was ma'aser reikim. What that means is arimi kan v'arimi kan. On both sides of the pareches, there was an image of a lion. Ma'aser chayeshev, when it adds in ma'aser chayeshev, it's arimi kan v'chalak mikan. There was a lion on one side and it was smooth, it was blank on the other side. The Charana Amar, and Charana says ma'aser reikim is arimi kan v'chalak mikan. It was a lion on this side and it was smooth on the other side. Ma'aser chayeshev means arimi kan v'neshar mikan. There was an eagle on the other side. So you're just analyzing the work of art here. They wove in different images to it, but the weaving didn't go through to the other side. They had tremendous amounts of craftsmanship here, that they were able to have one side display an image of a lion, and the other side was either blank, or they had an image of an eagle. Just to continue, B'shmeina v'shtayim riboy ha'sanasis. So although the line that we're paraphrasing here says it was 820,000 threads, the Taktin Chadatin says, this line is going back on the line that says it required 300 Kehanim to ultimately immerse it into the mikvah. The Gemara, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bizna b'shem Shmuel, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bizna in the name of Shmuel says guzma. It's an exaggeration. They didn't need 300 Kehanim. That's a tremendous amount of people to tevel pareches. It was an exaggeration, but ultimately they were just emphasizing how large it was. Taman tanina, there we learned Maseches Tamid. Pa'amim haya alea kishleish me'ais kor. It talked about the ashes that was on top of the mizbeach, and it says sometimes there was so much ash it was like 300 kor. Now, if you analyze a base kor, it's just a huge amount. Talking about 300 kor of ashes on top of the mizbeach is nearly impossible, and therefore this is another example of a Mishnah that uses the term 300 to demonstrate that it was a lot. And it was, again, Rabbi Yesi Rabbi Boon b'shem Shmuel Guzman says, you're right, it was a lot, but again, that is another example of a Mishnah using an exaggeration to bring out the fact, to highlight that there was a lot. That will stop for today. Wish you all a wonderful day and a beautiful week.